Welcome everyone. I'm Ursula Stevens from ACSL and we are so pleased to have you here today for our webinar. We're very excited about it. It's a very inspiring session presented by Simon Davies, who's with us today from Safeguarding Services. But just before we start, I just want to make sure that you know that we're recording the session, the webinar, and you'll be able to get a link to that when we finish. And our next seminar, just while we're waiting for the last few people to come in, is on the 18th of September. Father Neil Muir from the Holy Spirit Seminary in Banyo will actually be discussing, his topic is clergy leading cultural change. And then we'll have on the 16th of October, Dr. Mark Blason, who will be addressing moral injury. So two very interesting seminars coming up. So I've got with me today, I've got Shannon, who's managing the back end. Shannon, just give a wave so that everyone can see you. There you go. Shannon is the person who's answering your questions and monitoring the chat for us. And Tanya is here today from ACSL as well. She's supporting us and making sure that everything keeps on track. Let's start, first of all, just to bring ourselves into the presence of God and the work that we're all doing as safeguarding officers, and start with our general prayer that we use for all of our webinars. So, gracious God, provide us with a listening heart so that we can see and hear the voice of children and adults at risk. May our organisations, our authorities and families listen to, respect, and do what's required to keep children and adults at risk safe. And we ask you to help each of us to exercise our duties with compassion, integrity, and clarity as we work together to enact real change and uphold the safety of all who come into contact with our church and in our communities. Amen. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm in Canberra today, facilitating this session from the land of the Gundungurra people, and pay respects to the elders, past and present, and the traditional owners of all of the lands on which we're all meeting today. We honour our First Nations people and their culture and connection to land, sea, and community. And of course, we always want to acknowledge the lifelong trauma of abuse victims and their survivors and families, and the failure of the Catholic Church to protect and believe and respond justly to children and adults at risk that were abused within the church, and the consequent breach of community trust that delivered to the church. So now, all microphones are off today because we're just going to be hearing, first of all, from Simon, this wonderful presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So please place your questions in the chat box and we'll follow through and direct them to Simon at the end of the presentation. So let me now introduce Simon to you. He's the Managing Director of Services, Safeguarding Services, which is a specialist consultancy that provides investigation, training and advisory services to organisations that are working with children and adults at risk. And many of you will know Simon from his work. He's engaged widely with the church over many years, and he speaks at national and international forums on child protection and professional conduct and cyber safety and organisational integrity, because he comes from a background of over 25 years in law enforcement, risk and professional standards. So we are very blessed to have Simon and his expertise today. But today we've invited Simon to really present on an important piece of work that he's part of, and that is the International Safeguarding Conference. The conference is held every year in Rome, and Simon is part of the organisation committee for that conference. But this year, Simon provided an incredible presentation that we've asked him to present again today on a global overview of thematic findings from the conference, with a particular focus on women's experience, the safeguarding context. So no further ado, I'm handing over to Simon now. Thank you so much, Simon. We're waiting with bated breath.
Thanks very much, Ursula. No pressure. And it's lovely to see everyone. I know a lot of faces on the screen, which makes it nice to present. I feel I'm in a safe space, seeing all the familiar faces, which is lovely. As Ursula mentioned, just I can't go past without a gratuitous plug of the conference, and I'd encourage everyone to come if you can. It's in Rome, so that's the destinations. It's not a hardship to go there personally, but it's from just for your diaries. It's from 15 to 19 June next year, and the conference topic for next year is cross-cultural challenges with embedding safeguarding, so that will relate to a lot of both orders and dioceses and other faith-based organisations trying to embed safeguarding where we have mixed cultures. As Ursula mentioned, so just a bit of background with the conference for those who aren't familiar with it. It usually starts, it's unusual in that we get what we call working groups, and they meet online about 4 or 5 times prior to the in-person conference occurring in the June. And they're geographically based, and that's what the presentation will be based around, is really their discussions over the 4 or 5 meetings they had, and really the challenges of women within the church environment as it pertains to safeguarding. So that's just a bit of context, so it doesn't come to you blind. I'll just share the screen and we can start. Hopefully the technology works. I'm sure someone will let me know if they can't see it. So as I mentioned to you, this will take you through the collective insights from the working groups, the global working groups, reflecting on women's experiences and roles in safeguarding within the church and broader society as well. What was lovely this year is that the title of the conference was Women of Strength, Women of Faith. And one of the group members from Africa, Sister Lillian Ebo, was so moved by her interactions with her working group that she penned a poem. Unfortunately, she's not here to read that to you, so I'll have the honour of doing that to you. But I thought it really sets the scene and grounds us into what we're talking about today. I woke up to the wonder of my being. I was called a woman. I sought the world if there was anything else. I questioned and I wondered. Alas, a woman of strength. In my imagination, I lived. In my innermost being, I survived. All around me, I craved and grappled. I grappled only to discover that I am a woman of faith. In my world, I questioned survival. Happiness seemed like a mirage. Sadness seemed like the only option. Happiness, sadness, and pains, the only hope for survival. Alas, there stood a woman of strength. O my world, O my being, O the creator of women, where art thou in my world? Alas, I could hear the voice calling. O you women of faith, in the morning there came light, shades of hopes from the many voices, voices from deep within, voices from my outside world saying, you are a woman of strength, you are a woman of faith. As you now know, the working groups were encouraged to delve into the realities women face concerning abuse and safeguarding, aiming to inform our collective understanding and actions prior to meeting in person during the conference. 12 regional groups convened in person and online between February and May this year. And today we'll be looking at the key themes and visual representations coming from those groups. Each month, groups focused on specific themes, building upon each discussion to culminate in comprehensive reports and creative posters that I'll share with you today also. The final outputs were designed to encapsulate the depth of discussions, providing both analytical and visual representations of each group's findings. Groups' final reports were guided by these 3 questions. If you just take a minute to either note these down or really try and remember them, it becomes quite, you'll see in a minute, it becomes quite critical. One of the groups in particular, it really had a lot of commentary about the questions themselves, and it's quite interesting. So if you just take note of those in your mind. So firstly, I'll explore with you what I felt were common themes amongst all the groups, no matter what part of the world people were from, which was quite interesting that they resonate throughout the world. Across regions, the entrenchment of patriarchal systems and clerical dominance emerged as significant barriers to women's empowerment and safeguarding. The pervasive culture of silence, often reinforced by shame and fear, prevents many women from speaking out. And women are at the forefront of safeguarding, often providing support and advocacy without formal acknowledgement or authority. It's actually quite interesting. A reflection I had after this presentation was that even within Australia, some of the working parties that I'm on, both at a diocesan and a religious order level, most of the professionals and also religious undertaking this work tend to be women. So it's quite interesting. They really are at the forefront. Structural inequalities, including economic dependence and cultural norms, compound the risks women face, necessitating comprehensive approaches to address these layers of oppression. And transformative change requires systemic reforms, inclusive leadership, and the elevation of survivors' voices to reshape safeguarding practices effectively. So there's some of the common themes we're seeing across the world that people have that consistent feedback in these areas. Now we'll take a look at some of the regional differences that are just for those parts of the world. The Anglophone Africa group identified fear, not only emotional, but cultural, spiritual, and institutional, as a major mechanism sustaining abuse. Victims fear not being believed, losing their place in religious life, or damaging family honour was very important. They also highlighted structural barriers, inadequate complaint pathways, limited economic options, and the internalisation of silence due to patriarchal norms. Abuse is compounded when church authorities are not held accountable or when female religious have no independent support mechanisms. As I mentioned, each group also constructed a poster as part of their outputs from the group. Unfortunately, on the screen, it's probably a little difficult to see. We had beautiful, we printed them in A3 size so people could reflect on them throughout the course of the week of the conference. But when you get the presentation, you'll be able to zoom in and see it a bit better. But I believe their poster, the African poster that is one of the most powerful symbolic representations submitted during the conference. It is titled Embodiments of the Silenced Victim and is framed by a stark proverb: the power of the lion lies in our fear of it. In other words, what do we not confront will control us. The group chose to structure their poster in two panels. On the left, we see the reality of what they call forget everything and run, a state of fear. This side depicts the internal dialogue of countless survivors. Shut up, you're ugly. Nobody will believe you. It's all your fault. These messages, imposed by abusers, internalised through cultural stigma, reinforced by patriarchal norms, create what the group calls embodiments of silencing. The overlapping hands covering the woman's face represent community complicity, societal judgment, and institutional failure. But then there is a turning point. The right-hand panel reclaims power through a new acronym: Face Everything and Rise. Here we see the African woman reimagined as a warrior. She is not passive, she is prepared, and each piece of her armour symbolises a safeguarding principle. Shield, emotional resilience and protection. Armour, boundaries and self-worth. Spear, assertiveness and the ability to seek help. Headgear, mental clarity and critical thinking. Footwear, grounding in community, values and stability. Belt, self-regulation, discipline and dignity. And jewellery, self-love, healing from abuse. This metaphor, the warrior fully equipped for safeguarding, is their proposal for how women, communities and the church should respond. The message is not individualistic, but deeply communal. Safeguarding must be rooted in cultural identity, adapted to context and spiritually grounded. The group further explains that fear in their context is not just emotional, it is structural. It is fear of stigma, of economic loss, of religious retaliation, of familial rejection. And so the first work of safeguarding must be to name that fear and disarm it by creating space for voice, truth-telling, and communal accountability. Their poster invites us to move beyond silence, not just to speak, but to rise. It reframes safeguarding as resistance and healing as collective empowerment. And it reminds us that in the battle for dignity and justice, silence is not an option. We now move to South America, and they reported that clericalism across lay and ordained sectors continues to inhibit women's roles and trivialise abuse disclosures. Power is deeply embedded in church structures and theological discourse. Furthermore, women's leadership and safeguarding roles are only symbolic. Actual decision-making power remains concentrated in male clerical hands, limiting women's influence in shaping policies or responding meaningfully to cases of harm. Their vibrant collage-style poster is titled "Weaving Networks of Listening, Support and Hope." It uses visual metaphors to communicate not only the lived experience of women survivors of abuse, but also the community-based solutions that safeguarding must pursue. Each visual element in the poster has been chosen with symbolic intent, and the layout itself mimics a tapestry of communal weaving, emphasising connection, interdependence, and collective resilience. The left-hand column introduces the core conditions of harm, which are identified as dependence, women's social and economic dependence on male authority figures or religious superiors, which restricts autonomy and increases vulnerability. Guilt, the centralised sense of fault or shame, often reinforced by cultural expectations that women should endure or remain silent. And cycles of violence, the systemic repetition of harm due to structural inequalities, family violence, and institutional complicity. These are not individual pathologies, but collective wounds formed and perpetuated by deeply embedded social norms, machismo, and uneven power dynamics. In the centre, we see the central phrase emerging from a central image of hands holding up a house-like structure. This sheltering from form represents not only safe physical space, but also relational space, the psychological safety created through listening, accompaniment, and non-judgmental support. On the right-hand side, the poster proposes a model of safeguarding based on 3 interconnected actions: accompany healing processes, prioritising long-term support rather than quick fixes, allowing time, dignity, and agency for survivors, enabling conversations, creating cultural and ecclesial permission for difficult dialogues, especially around sexuality, power, and institutional failure, and sustain uncomfortable questions. Instead of rushing to resolve tensions, communities must stay with the discomfort of questions such as, why did this happen here? Who knew? And what must change? The bottom row visually and verbally celebrates women not as passive victims, but as resilient women sustaining life. These women are shown embracing one another, running forward, standing together. Counter images to isolation, shame, and helplessness. Importantly, the poster does not frame safeguarding as a top-down, punitive model. Rather, it invites the church and broader community to become a woven network of listening and hope, a space where harm is named, survivors are accompanied, and structural change is cultivated through relational, sustained commitment. The group's final report adds that Latin America faces some of the world's highest rates of feminicide, clerical abuse, and migration-related exploitation. In that context, safeguarding cannot remain theoretical. It must be embodied in every parish, school, convent, and family system. This poster then becomes both testimony and roadmap. We now move to the Polish group, who exposed the continued silencing of abuse within female congregations, where obedience, spiritual manipulation, and misinterpreted community values discourage reporting. They also identified deep-seated cultural myths. Women must be polite, must not cause conflict, and should endure suffering quietly. These ideas inhibit women from recognizing abuse, especially when it's emotional, spiritual, or systemic rather than physical. They called themselves the Kintsugi group, inspired by the Japanese practice of repairing broken pottery with gold. Their poster is a visual embodiment of that metaphor. Women as vessels, wounded, yes, but also healed and strengthened through solidarity, truth, and justice. Central to their reflection is a quote from Edith Stein, also known as Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, a Carmelite martyr and patroness of Europe. A woman's soul lives more intensely. This quote anchors their vision. Women's capacity for empathy, suffering, and relational depth has historically been exploited rather than honoured, particularly in religious settings. The poster includes keywords that speak to both the causes of harm and the structures that perpetuate silence. Dependency, protecting an institution, patriarchal mentality, boundaries, solidarity. The group also pointed to several taboo topics: the emotional and sexual abuse that occurs between women religious, the use of confession or spiritual direction to exert coercive control, the hidden suffering of nuns, transferred maliciously, overworked, or silenced when they speak out. Despite these challenges, their tone is hopeful. They describe a shift underway. More women religious now speak publicly, include safeguarding information, and demand space to name harm. The poster reflects this transition, not from brokenness to perfection, but from silence to collective voice. The Kintsugi group reframes safeguarding not just as compliance or protection, but as restoration, a process of honouring brokenness, refusing shame, and building spiritual and structural integrity into the future of the church. We now move to the Italian group, who focused on the specific vulnerabilities of migrant women, particularly undocumented individuals who are exploited, ignored by services, and often re-traumatized when seeking help from church or civil authorities. They also noted that church responses to abuse are often shaped by a desire to protect reputation, not victims. Theological justifications, such as spiritualizing obedience, were seen to shield perpetrators and silence the abused. They produced this bold and visually minimalist poster that makes a profound statement using 4 key terms: resilience, justice, gazes, and patriarchy. The poster's central text reads, "By rediscovering the strength of collective resilience, we reaffirm the urgency of a justice capable of breaking down patriarchal structures and opening itself to new perspectives, ones that can embrace, protect, and transform." First, resilience is not portrayed as individual perseverance, but as a collective force, a shared capacity for survival, healing, and redefinition. The group explicitly rejected the ideas that safeguarding is about personal coping or quiet endurance. Instead, they assert that resilience must lead to systemic transformation. That leads to their second concept, justice. For this group, justice is not simply due process or institutional compliance. It is political, theological, and social. Justice means redistributing power, particularly by demasculinizing church structures. It requires the active renunciation of male privilege, including within religious orders, seminaries, and episcopal governance. The third term, gazes, refers to perspective and visibility. The group called for a re-education of how we look at victims, at women, and at the church. Too often, women's suffering is seen either as peripheral or spiritualized. New gazes require us to see survivors as agents, not as burdens, to view safeguarding as central to ecclesial credibility, not as an administrative burden. Finally, patriarchy is named not abstractly, but concretely. The group reported that in Italy, women still face structural unemployment and wage disparity, religious messaging that portrays them as inherently submissive or as Eves, the manipulation of obedience and spiritual guidance, and persistent exclusion from theological, canonical, and pastoral leadership. We now move to the Mexican group, who highlighted the extreme risk facing migrant women, many fleeing violence in Central America only to face assault, trafficking, or exploitation during their journey. They also critique clericalism and machismo in church culture, noting that many women working in safeguarding or accompanying victims are still excluded from leadership or systemically sidelined in church commissions and canonical processes. The group structured their reflection around a theologically grounded but institutionally challenging statement. A church without women is like imagining the apostles without Mary. This framing makes clear that women are not supplementary to the church and safeguarding, they are central. The group described how women are often the ones offering accompaniment, psychological support, pastoral presence, and practical care to survivors, yet their roles are still undervalued or unrecognised by church structures. The group identified two dominant barriers to effective safeguarding in the Mexican context. Cultural machismo, a widespread social norm that discourages women from reporting abuse, limits their participation in leadership, and reinforces harmful gender roles. Clericalism, a culture that prioritises institutional image over truth and silences both survivors and the women supporting them. The group noted that canonical and pastoral processes are often inaccessible, re-traumatising or dismissive of women's experiences. In response, the group called for structural and cultural transformation. Specifically, zero tolerance policies must be implemented and enforced at every level. Women's leadership must be formally recognised in safeguarding, canon law, and diocesan commissions. Economic empowerment initiatives are needed to protect women in vulnerable or dependent roles. And justice centres and pastoral support spaces should be created to accompany survivors and challenge impunity. The group closed their reflection by urging the church to move beyond symbolic inclusion. Women, they insisted, are already doing the work of safeguarding. What is needed now is visibility, authority, and co-responsibility so that healing and justice can become real, not rhetorical. We now move to the Philippine context. Due to the large numbers of Filipinos that participate in the conference, there were two groups, so I'll go through both groups as reflections. They both identified that women face barriers to reporting not only because of family and cultural expectations, but because legal and church systems often reinforce male dominance. The group reported that even when abuse is recognised, women are silenced through shame, reputational threats, or fear of expulsion from church or ministry roles. They called for survivor-led reforms and increased female participation in ecclesial decision-making. The first group titled their poster Bravehearts, Asian Voices for the Vulnerable, and structured their poster around three key concepts: empowerment, patriarchy, and voice. Their first focus, empowerment, highlighted the transformative potential of women when allowed to lead, decide, and speak. They argued that women do not change themselves, they change families, parishes, and entire communities. However, this potential remains constrained by cultural and religious systems that deny them full agency. The second theme, patriarchy, was framed not just as a cultural phenomenon, but as a deeply embedded system operating across laws, traditions, and church institutions. The group described how patriarchy silences women, justifies control, and sustains environments where abuse is normalised or ignored. They noted that this system does not need to be violent or to be harmful. It operates subtly through exclusion and minimisation. Third, the group lifted up voice as the heart of safeguarding. For them, voice represents truth-telling, resistance, and hope. They observed that many women in their region are still unable to speak freely due to fear of disbelief, retaliation, or spiritual judgment. Where women have spoken, they have often been marginalised rather than listened to. The group's assertion was clear: a woman's voice is her power. In response to these challenges, the group advocated for legal and institutional reform to address gender-based violence and support survivors, greater visibility for women in leadership, safeguarding and church governance, survivor-informed safeguarding training across dioceses and ministries, and cultural education programs to shift societal attitudes around gender, power, and voice. The second group, which is from Cebu City, framed their poster around the three questions. On the potential of women, they stressed that women already hold essential roles in family, community, and church life when supported by education, leadership, opportunities, and legal protection. They emerge not only as survivors, but as leaders of transformation from grassroots to policy levels. The second section examines barriers. The group points to deeply embedded patriarchal norms, especially within church structures, that objectify women, silence disclosures, and perpetuate violence through shame, obedience, and institutional power imbalances. They note that vows of obedience, especially in religious life, can be weaponized to silence or control women. Their third section proposes solutions. Begin gender-sensitive education early, provide legal aid, shelters, and psychological support, promote collaboration between genders in leadership, and cultivate community-based safeguarding cultures that include women at every level. In summary, the Cebu City Group calls for transformation, not through charity, but through equity, giving women the autonomy, voice, and safety to lead safeguarding reforms themselves. The Central and East European Group reflected on how cultural and religious systems often frame women's freedom as conditional, acceptable only when it fits conventional roles like caregiver, mother, or obedient follower. They also noted that theology is frequently used to justify gender inequality. Women are expected to be submissive or sacrificial and rarely participate in the formation of liturgical or moral teaching. These factors severely limit their safety and self-determination. They produced this sharply analytical and politically aware reflection on the realities faced by women in their region. Their poster is divided into three sections: empowerment, underestimated, and participation. In the first section, empowerment, the group challenged the assumption that women's capacity for self-determination is natural or automatic. They argued that it is, in fact, the outcome of historic struggle, a process shaped by marginalisation, resistance, and the building of solidarity across generations. They noted that societies often recognise women's value only when it aligns with utility or productivity. But true empowerment, they asserted, must include autonomy, emotional agency, and freedom from externally imposed roles. The second section, underestimated, explores the cultural, social, and religious factors that inhibit women's freedom. Here, the group was especially critical of the misuse of religion. For example, limiting women's roles in the church, portraying God exclusively in male terms, and reinforcing obedience as a virtue for women but not men. They observed that patriarchal norms reduce women to fixed identities: wife, mother, helper, while punishing those who challenge expectations. Women are seen not as full moral and theological agents, but as support figures to male leadership. The third section, participation, is a direct appeal for structural change. The group argues that safeguarding cannot succeed unless women have full and equal access to participation in social, political, and ecclesial life. They called for the elimination of traditions that exclude women from decision-making, the inclusion of survivors in shaping safeguarding responses, and the recognition of women's lived experience as a theological and pastoral resource. Central to their message is a reframing of safeguarding from protection to co-agency. Their language is not victim-oriented, it is political. They describe women as actors in a system they are expected to serve but rarely permitted to shape, and they make clear that that must change. In summary, the Central and Eastern European group calls us not only to protect women, but to share power with them. Safeguarding, in their view, is not charity, it is justice. Moving now to the United Kingdom and Ireland group, they criticise the minimising language often used when discussing abuse against women. They observe that descriptions of male victims tend to emphasise trauma, while female experiences are framed with softer, less serious terminology. They also noted a lack of institutional understanding of trauma-informed safeguarding. There is little professional supervision, limited integration of survivors' experiences, and inconsistent responses to adult disclosures, particularly in diocesan structures. Their poster mirrors the clarity and precision of their final report. It is structured under 4 categories: education, culture, knowledge, and expectations, each offering a lens through which to understand both harm and possibility. Under education, the group identified a fundamental need to reframe safeguarding as an issue of justice, not only compliance. They advocated for church-wide education on healthy relationships, power dynamics, and gender-based violence, grounded not only in secular human rights frameworks, but also in Catholic social teaching. They emphasised that awareness raising is not enough. Formation must translate into practice, policy, and leadership reform. In the culture section, the group names several persistent dynamics within the church and wider society that inhibit women's safety. The internalisation of shame, stigmas around sexuality, clerical defensiveness, a normative ideal of female obedience and politeness. These, they argued, often lead women to normalise abusive behaviours or remain silent due to fear of being blamed or not believed. Under knowledge, the group raised a critical challenge. There is a severe lack of data around adult women's experiences of abuse in church contexts. They noted that even when reports exist, there is frequently a failure to act on the findings. The group called for systemic data collection and public transparency, not only about the abuse of minors, but also about spiritual, emotional, and sexual abuse of adult women, including religious and lay personnel. The final section, expectations, was where their tone shifted from diagnostic to directive. The group consciously chose expectations over hopes or suggestions to signal urgency. They made it clear that cultural change requires trauma-informed safeguarding at all levels of church leadership, safe spaces where disclosures are met with belief and follow through, and accountability for past failures, not just apologies, but institutional reform. Their message was simple. The church must stop asking women to hope. It must meet their expectations with action, equity, and truth. The Australian group observed that women lead most safeguarding work in church contexts, yet they lack the authority to make binding decisions or reform processes. Clericalism, in their view, is not merely theological, but structural. Men control governance, women execute but do not legislate. This has produced a safeguarding culture that is under-resourced, overburdened, and frequently dismissed. Their poster, entitled Strong Women, Strong Church, brings together professional safeguarding knowledge and the lived experience of those working within church structures. It distills complex realities into 3 central headings: empowerment, silencing, and restoration. Under empowerment, the group asserted that women already carry the wisdom, courage, and expertise to lead change in safeguarding. They are not waiting to be equipped, they are already doing the work. What's missing is institutional recognition. The group made clear that safeguarding leadership must be transferred, not merely supported. Women must be entrusted with decision-making power, resourced appropriately, and included in governance beyond tokenism. The second theme, silencing, points to the institutional dismissal of women's voices, especially those of survivors and female professionals. The group observed that many safeguarding systems are shaped by clericalism, where women's experiences are filtered through male hierarchies and where language around harm is softened or spiritualized rather than confronted. They highlighted that in safeguarding commissions and diocesan structures, women often lead the day-to-day work but are excluded from strategic decision-making. Their knowledge is often seen as supportive rather than authoritative. Finally, restoration frames safeguarding not as a process of managing allegations, but of restoring dignity. The group advocated for trauma-informed safeguarding that is relational, ongoing, and survivor-led. They stressed that effective safeguarding includes professional supervision and psychological safety for those supporting victims, policies that include gender-sensitive pathways and power-conscious processes, cultural change within parishes and institutions that values empathy over control. Their call to action is theological as well as procedural, to move from exclusion to co-responsibility and from silencing to full participation. In their words, when women are truly empowered, they have the potential to reshape the church and community. We now move to North America and Canada. The groups distinguish themselves from other groups by rejecting the original questions posed to groups as structurally misframed, demanding instead a church-centered focus on accountability. As I mentioned earlier, those three questions at the start, this group really challenges them. They also uniquely critique canon law and adult safeguarding failures, calling for reforms to protect adult women from spiritual, emotional, and sexual abuse. The groups felt the conference questions were paternalistic, disempowering, and misdirected. They proposed flipping the questions to centre institutional accountability rather than female capacity, asserting that the issue is not what women can do, but what the church must do. The first group took a bold and deliberate approach to their poster. They went with a minimalistic but technologically advanced approach. No poster shows the pain, no art captures the anguish, no headline shares the hope. See what we have to say. This is not a rejection of the visual medium, it is a lament, an expression that a poster can adequately capture the complexity, trauma, and institutional frustration expressed during the group's 4-month reflections. Their decision stems from several key themes in their final report. The inadequacy of the church's structures to protect adult women, deep disillusionment with institutional responses to abuse, and a recognition that the problem is not women's capacity, it is the system that fails them. As I mentioned, the group proposed flipping the original ISC questions. For example, instead of asking, what is the potential for women to become protagonists, they ask, what structural changes must the church commit to in order to recognise the leadership of women who already possess agency? Their poster then is not empty. It is charged with decades of institutional neglect, the exhaustion of survivors, and the repeated failure of systems to listen or act. The QR code invites people to read the full report, but I think this is even symbolic. It shifts the burden from superficial engagement to deeper reading, from aesthetics to accountability. This group reminds us that sometimes the most powerful act of safeguarding is to resist the urge to package trauma. Their silence on the page is not absence, it's protest. The second group's poster centres on the theme of hope, but this is not abstract hope. It is rooted in confrontation with the entrenched structures of inequality, especially clericalism, which they identify as a primary enabler of abuse. They make clear that the church's male-only hierarchical model fosters not only exclusion, but actual harm. Clericalism distorts spiritual authority and gives rise to physical, emotional, and spiritual abuse. Importantly, they highlight that this imbalance is not only perpetuated by clergy, but also by laity who elevate priests beyond accountability. This dual dynamic, the pedestal and the power, is what leaves women vulnerable. Their reflection concludes with concrete safeguarding imperatives, embedding abuse awareness into clergy formation programs, training all church personnel to identify early signs of abuse, creating a reporting culture that empowers women to set boundaries, and ensuring those subjected to abusive power are heard and accompanied. Their poster frames safeguarding as both a structural reform and a structural re-education project, one that must begin inside the church if it is to remain credible outside of the church. I believe these keywords encapsulate the essence of the discussions, reflecting the shared aspirations and challenges identified across all groups. These are some of the key people, and a big thanks to Karen Larkman for Australia. These people give a lot of their time to facilitate the groups, and then they compile the reports and try and get groups of up to 20 and 30 people to agree on particular aspects is not an easy task. So we certainly thank them across the world. I intentionally kept colouring the world map as I presented, you may have noticed, each group to highlight the reach of the conference, which I'm extremely personally proud of. This conference is all of us, but I would like to highlight the corners of the world that are unrepresented here and would urge you to consider and provide us with feedback on how we can improve this into the future. You'll notice a real underrepresentation from the Asia Pacific region. Obviously, Australia is well represented and New Zealand alike, but for me particularly, it's concerning that, and that may be language issues, but certainly if you had any feedback or encouragement or ideas and how we can change that, it'd be great to hear from you. And I end with reminding us of words that Sister Lillian gave us at the start of the conference. You are women of strength, you're women of faith. And thank you so much for your attention, and more than happy to discuss any of the aspects of that presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. That was riveting, inspirational, and hearing again those interpretations and the messages from those groups was really empowering. So hopefully by making this video available after today, more people will be able to share in the insights that you shared with us today. We do have an opportunity for some questions. I'm just looking in the chat. There's nothing there. We've just got lots of claps and lots of
Thank you.
Yeah. Emma's just mentioned your point about the lack of engagement with the Asia Pacific, and this was raised at the conference, and it has been raised in how we can actually be engaged more with the Episcopal conferences of the and the regional leaders forums of the Pacific region, and how perhaps we might be able to support and sponsor participation in the conference more broadly. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Simon.
Yes, I do. I as you know, I do a lot of work throughout Asia Pacific. I think language is a key inhibitor, and we've certainly looked at that at the conference, from almost becoming the UN, having multiple interpreters there, headphones, but that can become very cost prohibitive, all that setup and interpreters and what have you. Technology is improving. I'm hopeful that, there's some tech heads in the audience that can help us, but I think even from here, AI and what have you, perhaps with that instantaneous interpretation of presentations, etc., could make the conference a bit closer throughout Asia Pacific. But I myself, I for another organisation, assist them with safeguarding across Asia Pacific, and I've really found the meetings and discussions need to be in person, just to allow for that depth of conversation slow the English down, especially the Australian accent is unhelpful. So it's really slowing that conversation down and really engaging on that one-to-one level. And that's a cultural piece as well. But interestingly, communicating that to church in inverted commas, which is, very Europe-centric, is not easy. Just communicating that there are, 272 odd language groups across Asia Pacific, not to mention the cultures that exist as well, is difficult sometimes, I think, for Rome to understand unless they've been and seen it.
Well, hopefully Pope Leo has
Yes.
and will help. Do you have any thoughts about the application of the Universal Guidelines Framework across the Asia Pacific region, and what we as a missionary church could be doing to support that?
Yeah, I think there needs to be more encouragement in really taking the time to look at risk. I think risk is an important discussion point. Each culture, each environment has its own specific risks. What I've seen across Asia Pacific is the risk of just going, okay, Australia's got a code of conduct. I'll just cut and paste that into and put, our logo on it and it's done. Well, no one's going to read that. It doesn't translate well, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there needs to be a lot more encouragement about, hey, this is how we do it in Australia. We're not saying it's perfect. This suits our environment. I think sometimes there's that level of arrogance to say, well, because we're a first world English speaking country, we know everything. Well, yeah, we might know that in our context. We don't necessarily know it in yours. So there needs to be that accompaniment. I love the spiritual concept of accompaniment. That's what it needs to be, not big stick, not we won't fund your organisation or we won't fund your programs unless you meet our requirements in Australia, ACNC requirements, for instance. Everyone loves them, I'm sure. It needs to be translated culturally and linguistically into that environment. But that takes time and effort.
I think that it goes to the theme of the conference next year, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Quite specifically. So just in wrapping up, is there anything that we can be doing here in Australia to support the development of the conference, or when the next discussion groups will be formed, those kinds of things, how people can become involved and support the work
Absolutely.
of the coordinators?
So probably by the end of the year, if you keep an eye on the website, there'll probably be an invitation for people to join working groups. So I'd encourage you to sign up to that. It'll ask you whether you just want to be a participant or whether you'd like to facilitate a group. And then obviously probably around March, I think next year, it opens up to registrations for the conference. Unfortunately, Rome is not ideal for large conferences. So we've got a maximum capacity of about 250 people at the Gregorian University. So it is sort of a first in, best dressed. I'd encourage you to keep an eye on that. In terms of supporting Asia Pacific and the broader church, if anyone's got some loose change lying in the couch, we'd always welcome that, or you could consider a sponsorship program even within your own institute, that you sponsor someone from another part of the world to come to the conference. But it is very rich. Like any conference, it's the conversations they had in the hallways over a cup of coffee, etc. The presentations are great, but it's that connection and assistance that continues on. We're also looking at a possible concept next year of that accompaniment is to almost buddy up people from other sides of the world to say, how can we support each other and work together in furtherance of the safeguarding message.
Well, that's great, Simon. Thank you so much. So there are a few comments here. One from Emma suggesting that Caritas perhaps could help support connections, and also Louise, who attended the conference this year, suggesting that CRA may be able to help assist engagement with Oceania. So they're two leads that we can actually follow up.
Thanks so
going
much.
forward. Yeah. But thank you, Simon, again for the time. Thank you for the work that you do in supporting the international conference. It really is important to have an Australian presence in that conversation, I think, and you represent us so well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you for your presentation. So the slide deck and the commentary, will that be available as well?
More than happy to, yeah. Yeah, because I know
Wonderful.
there's a lot in there and some people might want to take it away and ponder it.
Yeah, very, very powerful, very powerful. And I think Sister Lillian's poem that you presented at the beginning and at the end really, remind us of women of strength and women of faith and women of courage and women of innovation as well. So thank you again. Thank you everyone for attending.